Imagine standing in the middle of a vast desert under a sky filled with endless stars, in a time when the world itself seemed to have lost its direction. Empires ruled with iron fists, tribes fought endless wars over pride and revenge, and human beings searched for meaning in statues carved from stone. The powerful crushed the weak. Daughters were sometimes buried alive out of shame, and truth had become so blurred that people no longer recognized the difference between the Creator and the things they had created with their own hands. Yet in the middle of that darkness, a story was about to begin that would change the destiny of humanity forever. Before we continue, take a moment to share something with us. Thank you for watching Islamic Insight channel. Tell us in the comments which country you are watching from, and if you love learning about Islam and the stories of the prophets, subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the journeys we explore together. Now return to that desert night and imagine the world as it was more than 14 centuries ago, because the arrival of one man would soon bring light to a civilization that had forgotten the path of the one God. Arabia in those days was a land of fierce independence and powerful traditions, but it was also a land deeply lost in spiritual confusion. The descendants of Prophet Ibrahim still lived there, and the Kaaba still stood in the valley of Makkah. Yet the original purpose of that sacred house had been almost completely forgotten. Ibrahim and his son Ismail had built the Kaaba as a place dedicated to the worship of Allah alone. But over generations, the people slowly drifted away from that truth. Idols were placed inside and around the sanctuary until hundreds of statues filled the area surrounding the Kaaba. Each tribe had its own idol, each claiming power over rain, victory, or fortune. Pilgrims traveled from across Arabia, not to worship the Creator of the heavens and the earth, but to bow before carved figures that could neither hear nor speak. Trade flourished in the city of Makkah because of this pilgrimage, and the leaders of the Quraysh tribe became wealthy and influential by managing the sanctuary and the caravans that traveled between Yemen and Syria. But prosperity did not mean justice. Tribal loyalty determined everything. If someone from one tribe harmed someone from another tribe, the conflict could explode into years of bloodshed. Revenge was considered a sacred duty, and entire generations grew up knowing nothing except cycles of retaliation. The weak had almost no protection. Slaves were bought and sold like objects. The poor struggled to survive while the powerful celebrated their status with poetry, wine, and pride. Would later describe it with chilling clarity when it asked what crime the buried girl had committed. Yet even in this environment, traces of the ancient message of Ibrahim still lingered in scattered memories and traditions. Some people remembered that the Kaaba had once been dedicated to one God. A few individuals refused to worship idols and searched quietly for the truth. There was a feeling, almost like a whisper across generations, that a final messenger would come to restore the original faith. The world beyond Arabia was also waiting without realizing it. To the north, the Byzantine Empire struggled with political and religious conflicts. To the east, the Persian Empire held immense power but was locked in rivalry and war with Byzantium. Across many lands, people debated theology, fought over doctrines, and argued about the nature of God, while the simple call to worship the Creator alone had been clouded by centuries of division. In the middle of this global tension, Arabia remained isolated yet strategically positioned between the great empires. Caravans carried goods, stories, and ideas through the desert routes, but no one could have imagined that this quiet region would soon become the birthplace of a message that would reshape civilizations. The valley of Makkah waited in silence, the Kaaba standing at its center, surrounded by idols that had stolen the devotion meant only for Allah. And then the year arrived that people would remember forever, a year marked by an event so dramatic that it would be preserved in the Quran itself. Far to the south, in Yemen, there ruled a powerful man named Abraha, He had built a magnificent cathedral in the city of Sana'a in the hope that it would become the new center of pilgrimage for the Arabs. His ambition was not small. He wanted the tribes of Arabia to abandon the Kaaba and travel instead to his grand church, bringing wealth and prestige to his kingdom. But the Arabs refused to abandon the sanctuary that had stood in Makkah for generations. Their loyalty to the Kaaba remained strong, even though many of them had filled it with idols. When Abraha realized that his cathedral would never replace the Kaaba as the spiritual center of Arabia, anger grew inside him. He decided that if the Arabs would not leave the Kaaba willingly, he would destroy it completely. So Abraha assembled a massive army and marched north toward Makkah. What made this army especially terrifying was the presence of elephants, enormous animals that the tribes of Arabia had never seen in battle before. The ground trembled beneath their steps as the army advanced through the desert. News of the approaching force spread quickly through Makkah, and fear gripped the people. The Quraysh tribe understood that they could not defeat such an army. Their weapons and numbers were far too small. Instead of preparing for a battle they could not win, they left the city and sought refuge in the surrounding hills and mountains. Their leader at the time, Abdul Talib, the grandfather of the Prophet, who would soon be born, placed his trust entirely in Allah. Standing near the Kaaba, he prayed for protection, knowing that the sacred house belonged to its true Lord. Then something extraordinary happened, something that would be remembered by every generation afterward. As Abraha's army approached the valley of Makkah, flocks of birds appeared in the sky. These were not ordinary birds traveling peacefully across the desert. According to the Quran in Surah Al-Fil, each bird carried small stones in its beak and claws. They flew over the invading army and released those stones upon them. What seemed like tiny pebbles struck with devastating power. The soldiers fell one after another, their formation collapsing into chaos. The mighty army that had marched with such confidence was destroyed in a way no one could have predicted. The elephants themselves refused to advance toward the Kaaba, stopping stubbornly as if an invisible barrier prevented them from moving forward. Abraha's campaign ended in complete failure, and the Kaaba remained standing exactly where it had always been. This event became known throughout Arabia as the Year of the Elephant. It was so significant that people began using it as a reference point for measuring time. When they spoke about events, they would say that something happened before the Year of the Elephant or after it. Yet the greatest significance of that year was still to come. Because in that very same year, in the city that had just been protected by divine intervention, a child would be born whose message would restore the Kaaba to its original purpose and call humanity back to the worship of Allah alone. In the quiet hours of that historic year, in the tribe of Quraysh, a woman named Amina gave birth to a son. The child's father, Abdullah, had already passed away months earlier while traveling for trade, leaving the boy an orphan before he had even entered the world. His grandfather, Abdul Talib, welcomed the newborn with deep affection and named him Muhammad, a name that carried the meaning of someone who is praised. It was not a common name in Arabia at the time, yet it would soon become one of the most beloved names in human history. From the very beginning, the life of Muhammad was marked by both hardship and quiet dignity. Losing his father before birth meant that he would grow up without the protection and support that most children depended on. Yet in the culture of Arabia, the extended family stepped in to care for such children. Abdul Muttalib took special interest in his grandson, often keeping him close by his side. People noticed the deep love the old leader had for the boy. Muhammad's early years followed the custom of Makkah, where infants were often sent to live for a time with Bedouin families in the desert so they could grow strong in the fresh air and learn pure Arabic. During this period, he was cared for by a woman named Halima al-Sa'diyah, whose household experienced unexpected blessings after taking the child into their care. But the shadow of loss would continue to follow him. When Muhammad was 6 years old, his mother Amina decided to travel with him to the city of Yathrib, later known as Medina, to visit relatives and the grave of his father. The journey brought moments of connection and family, yet tragedy struck on the return trip. Amina became ill during the journey and passed away in a place called Abwa. The young boy who had already lost his father now lost his mother as well. Imagine the weight of that moment for a child, one so young, traveling back toward Makkah, not with the comfort of a parent, but with the quiet understanding that he was now completely alone in the world. Yet even in that sorrow, care surrounded him. His grandfather, Abdul Muttalib, embraced the responsibility of raising him and treated him with exceptional kindness. Those who observed them together noticed how the elderly leader would allow the boy to sit in places where even the tribal elders would not sit, as if recognizing a special destiny he could not fully explain. The boy who had entered life as an orphan would grow into a man whose compassion for the weak and the vulnerable would become one of the defining qualities of his message. And although the world around him still lived in darkness, the light that would soon guide humanity had already begun its quiet journey in the heart of a child growing up in the valley of Makkah. After returning to Makkah as a young orphan, the boy who had already tasted loss so early in life found a new home under the care of his grandfather, Abdul Muttalib. The old leader of Quraysh was a respected figure in the city, known for his authority and wisdom, yet when it came to his grandson, he showed a softness that people rarely saw from him. There was a place near the Kaaba where Abdul Muttalib would sit on a special carpet while the elders of Quraysh gathered around him. No one dared to sit on that carpet out of respect for the old chief. Yet when the young Muhammad approached and climbed onto it, the elders would move to stop him. Abdul Muttalib would gently hold them back and say, "Leave my son alone, for by Allah he will have a great future." These were not just words spoken by a loving grandfather. Even in those early years there was something about the child that made people pause and observe him more carefully. But life had another test waiting. When Muhammad reached the age of 8, his grandfather also passed away. The boy who had already lost both parents now lost the man who had been his protector and guardian. Responsibility for him passed to his uncle Abu Talib, the brother of his father. Abu Talib was not a wealthy man, yet he was known for his generosity and loyalty. Despite having many children of his own and limited means, he welcomed Muhammad into his household with open arms and treated him like one of his own sons. In the tribal culture of Arabia, loyalty to family meant everything, and Abu Talib would remain one of the Prophet's most important protectors for many years to come. Growing up in the household of Abu Talib, Muhammad experienced the realities of ordinary life in Makkah. The family worked hard, and from an early age he learned the value of responsibility. Like many young boys in Arabia, he spent time tending sheep in the hills outside the city. This simple task might seem small, yet it shaped his character in ways that would later become clear. Long hours in the open desert gave him time to think, to observe the quiet rhythm of nature, and to develop patience. The life of a shepherd required calm judgment, careful attention, and the ability to guide a flock safely through difficult terrain. Many prophets before him had also been shepherds, and this early experience quietly prepared him for the leadership that would come later. As he grew into adolescence and then adulthood, something about Muhammad's character began to stand out more clearly to the people of Makkah. In a society where deception in trade was common and loyalty often depended on tribal advantage, he was known for honesty that never wavered. He did not participate in the drunken gatherings or the reckless behavior that many young men of his time considered normal. He avoided idol worship even though it surrounded him everywhere. When disputes arose between people, they trusted his judgment because they knew he would not lie or manipulate the truth. Over time, the people of Makkah gave him a title that reflected their respect for him. They called him Al-Amin, the trustworthy one. This reputation would open doors for him as he entered adulthood. Makkah was not a farming city. Its wealth came from trade. Caravans traveled north toward Syria and south toward Yemen, carrying goods such as leather, textiles, spices, and precious metals. These journeys required reliable merchants who could manage valuable cargo across dangerous desert routes. Muhammad became involved in this trade and quickly earned respect for the way he conducted business. He never cheated a customer, never broke a promise, and never hid the truth about the quality of goods. In a marketplace where many merchants exaggerated or deceived buyers to increase profit, his integrity stood out like a clear spring in the desert. Among the people who noticed his reputation was a woman named Khadijah bint Khuwaylid. She was one of the most respected and successful merchants in Makkah, known for her intelligence, dignity, and strong character. Khadijah managed large trading caravans and employed agents to conduct business on her behalf. When she heard about the honesty of Muhammad, she decided to entrust him with one of her caravans traveling north towards Syria. Along with him, she sent a servant named Seerah to assist and observe the journey. The caravan traveled across the long desert routes that connected Arabia to the markets of the north. These journeys were not easy. The sun was harsh, the distances were vast, and merchants often faced the risk of bandits or betrayal. Yet throughout the trip, Muhammad demonstrated the same honesty and fairness that had made him respected in Makkah. He negotiated deals with integrity and returned with profits greater than Khadijah had expected. But what impressed her even more were the reports from Seerah, who described the character he had witnessed during the journey. He spoke about Muhammad's calm nature, his fairness in trade, and the way people were drawn to his sincerity. When Khadijah heard these accounts, she began to see him not only as a trustworthy employee, but as a man of exceptional character. Despite being older than him, she recognized qualities that made him different from others in their society. She spoke with a close friend and eventually sent a proposal of marriage to Muhammad. At the time, he was 25 years old and Khadijah was 40. In the culture of Arabia, this difference in age was not unusual, yet the proposal carried deep significance. Muhammad accepted, and their marriage became one of the most remarkable partnerships in history. Their home was not built on wealth or status alone, but on mutual respect, loyalty, and deep affection. Khadijah supported her husband with wisdom and kindness, and he honored her with unwavering devotion. For many years, he took no other wife, even though such arrangements were common in Arabia. Together, they built a household filled with trust and compassion. They were blessed with children, including daughters who would grow up to play important roles in the early Muslim community. Among them was Fatima, who would later become deeply beloved among the companions. While Muhammad continued to work in trade and provide for his family, something inside him increasingly felt unsettled by the society around him. Makkah was prosperous, yet its prosperity often hid deep moral corruption. Idols surrounded the Kaaba, and people believed that these lifeless statues could bring them fortune or protection. Wealthy merchants celebrated their success with pride while the poor struggled in hardship. Conflicts could erupt over the smallest insult, and cruelty toward slaves and the weak remained common. Muhammad observed all of this quietly, but his heart did not feel at peace with it. Instead of participating in the excesses of society, he developed a habit that would become increasingly important. He sought solitude, not as an escape from responsibility, but as a way to reflect deeply about life and the creator of the universe. Just outside Makkah stood a mountain known as Jabal al-Nur, the Mountain of Light. High on its rocky slope was a small cave called Hira. It was a narrow place, simple and quiet, overlooking the valley below. From that vantage point, one could see the city of Makkah in the distance and the Kaaba standing at its center. Muhammad began to retreat to this cave for periods of reflection. Sometimes he would spend several nights there, bringing food and water with him while he contemplated the signs of creation. The desert sky above him stretched endlessly, filled with stars that seemed to whisper about the vastness of the universe. In those quiet hours, he would think about the legacy of Ibrahim and the forgotten worship of the one God. He would think about the injustice he saw in society and the way people had turned away from truth. His heart searched for clarity in a world that had lost its way. This practice of retreat and reflection became a regular part of his life as he approached the age of 40. Each year during the month of Ramadan, he would spend longer periods in the Cave of Hira, devoting himself to contemplation and prayer according to the tradition of seeking closeness to the Creator. He did not yet know that the moment that would change human history was drawing near. The quiet nights in that cave were preparing him for something far greater than he could imagine. The man known among his people as the trustworthy one, the merchant respected for his honesty, the husband devoted to his family, was about to receive a responsibility that no human being had carried since the time of the previous prophets. And while he sat in that cave above the sleeping city of Makkah, reflecting on the Creator of the heavens and the earth, the world below continued its ordinary routines without realizing that the final messenger of Allah was only moments away from receiving the first words of revelation that would echo across centuries. The nights in the Cave of Hira had become familiar to Muhammad. The climb up the rocky mountain outside Makkah was steep and quiet, far removed from the noise of markets and tribal arguments below. When he sat inside the narrow cave and looked out over the valley, the city seemed small, almost fragile beneath the endless desert sky. Those moments of solitude allowed him to think about the Creator of the heavens and the earth, about the forgotten legacy of Prophet Ibrahim, and about the confusion that had overtaken his people. He did not worship the idols that surrounded the Kaaba, and his heart could never accept that lifeless stones deserved devotion. Something inside him knew that the truth had once been clearer, that the one who created the stars above must also be the one worthy of worship on earth. For years these reflections continued quietly, shaping his character and deepening his awareness, until the night arrived that would change everything. It was during the month of Ramadan when Muhammad was about 40 years old. The desert air was still, and the silence of the mountain seemed heavier than usual. As he sat inside the Cave of Hira, absorbed in reflection, something suddenly filled the space around him with a presence unlike anything he had ever experienced. An angel stood before him. This was Jibril, the angel entrusted with bringing revelation from Allah to his prophets. The moment was overwhelming. The angel commanded him with a word that carried immense weight. "Read." Muhammad answered honestly that he could not read. Again the command came, and again he replied that he was not able to read. The angel then embraced him with a strength that left him trembling and repeated the command once more. Out of that moment came words that would become the first verses of the Quran. "Read in the name of your Lord, who created the human being from a clinging substance. Read, and your Lord is the most generous, the one who taught by the pen, taught the human being what he did not know." These words marked the beginning of revelation, but for Muhammad, the experience was deeply frightening. He had never encountered anything like it before. His heart raced and his body trembled as he hurried down the mountain, moving through the darkness back toward his home in Makkah. When he entered the house, he called out to his wife, Khadijah, asking her to cover him with a cloak because he was shaking with fear. She wrapped him in a blanket and listened carefully as he described what had happened in the cave. Muhammad worried about what the experience might mean, yet Khadijah responded with calm certainty. She reminded him of the man he had always been, a man known for truthfulness, kindness to relatives, generosity to the poor, and care for the vulnerable. She told him with conviction that Allah would never disgrace someone with such noble character. Khadijah did not stop there. Wanting to understand more about the experience, she took Muhammad to visit her cousin, Waraqah ibn Nawfal, an elderly man who had knowledge of earlier scriptures and the traditions of previous prophets. After hearing Muhammad describe what had happened in the cave, Waraqah became deeply moved. He explained that the being who had appeared was the same angel who had brought revelation to Prophet Musa centuries earlier. Then he said something that carried both honor and warning. He told Muhammad that he had been chosen as a prophet for his people, but that his message would face fierce opposition. Waraka expressed a wish that he could live long enough to support him when that time came. Not long after this meeting, Waraka passed away, but his words remained as a quiet confirmation of the immense responsibility that had just begun. In the days that followed, Muhammad began to understand that the encounter in the cave had not been a single, isolated event. Revelation continued to come gradually, bringing guidance, correction, and instruction. Each message came through the Angel Jibril, and each one strengthened the awareness that he had been chosen as the final messenger of Allah. At first, the call to faith spread quietly among those closest to him. The very first person to believe in him without hesitation was Khadijah. Her faith was immediate and unwavering, and she became a source of strength and reassurance during the earliest and most uncertain days of the mission. Not long after Khadijah accepted the message, a young boy in their household also embraced the new faith. This was Ali ibn Abi Talib, the son of Abu Talib. Ali had grown up in the home of Muhammad and Khadijah, and even at a young age, he recognized the truthfulness of the man who had cared for him. Another early believer was Zayd ibn Haritha, who had been freed by Muhammad and treated like a member of the family. Then came one of the most influential conversions in the early history of Islam. Abu Bakr ibn Abi Quhafa, a close friend of Muhammad known for his wisdom and integrity, accepted the message as soon as he heard it. Abu Bakr was deeply respected among the people of Makkah, and his acceptance of Islam opened the door for others to follow. Through Abu Bakr, several important figures joined the small circle of believers. Among them were Uthman ibn Affan, a merchant known for his generosity, Zubair ibn al-Awwam, Talha ibn Ubaidullah, and others who would later become key companions of the Prophet. In those early days, the community of Muslims was still very small. They prayed quietly and gathered in private homes to learn the words of revelation that continued to descend. Their faith centered on a simple but powerful truth. There is only one God, Allah, the creator of the heavens and the earth, and Muhammad is his messenger. For a period of time, the message spread quietly. But eventually the command came for the Prophet to proclaim the truth openly. When he began calling the people of Makkah to abandon idols and worship Allah alone, the reaction was immediate and intense. The leaders of Quraysh were deeply disturbed by the message. Their wealth and influence were closely tied to the idol-centered pilgrimage that surrounded the Kaaba. If people stopped worshipping idols, the entire structure of power and profit in Makkah could collapse. At first, they tried to dismiss Muhammad by calling him a poet or a magician. When that did not stop the growing influence of his message, they turned to ridicule and mockery. Soon, ridicule turned into hostility. The early Muslims were often from the weaker segments of society, including slaves and those without powerful tribal protection. These believers became targets for severe persecution. One of the most well-known examples was Bilal ibn Rabah, an Ethiopian slave who accepted Islam. His master tortured him under the burning sun of the desert, placing a heavy stone on his chest while demanding that he abandon the worship of Allah. Yet even in that agony, Bilal continued repeating a single word that captured the essence of Islamic belief. One God. One God. Another early believer, Yasir, along with his wife Sumaya and their son Ammar, endured brutal treatment for their faith. Sumaya became one of the first martyrs of Islam when she was killed by a leader of Quraysh because she refused to renounce her belief in Allah. These events revealed the harsh reality that the message of Islam would not spread without sacrifice and struggle. Yet despite the cruelty they faced, the believers remained firm. The Prophet himself endured constant insults and harassment. People threw dust on him while he prayed. Others spread rumors about him in the streets of Makkah. Yet he responded with patience and dignity. His mission was not built on anger or revenge, but on unwavering commitment to the truth that had been revealed to him. As the small group of believers continued to grow, the tension in Makkah increased. The leaders of Quraysh began to realize that the message they had tried to ignore was becoming something far more powerful than they had expected. And so the stage was set for a long struggle between truth and opposition, a struggle that would test the faith of the believers and shape the future of the Islamic community in ways no one in Makkah could yet imagine. As the message of Islam continued to spread quietly through the streets and homes of Makkah, the leaders of Quraysh began to realize that the movement they once mocked was slowly growing stronger. They had tried ridicule, insults, and torture against the weakest followers, but none of it had succeeded in silencing the message. Instead, every act of cruelty seemed to deepen the faith of those who believed. People were willing to suffer rather than abandon the words revealed to Muhammad. This frightened the leaders of the city more than anything else, because it meant that the message was not fading away. It was becoming rooted in the hearts of people. At first, the leaders of Quraysh attempted negotiation. They approached Abi Talib, the uncle and protector of Muhammad, hoping to pressure him into stopping his nephew from preaching. They offered wealth, power, and leadership over the city if Muhammad would simply stop criticizing their idols. Some even suggested a compromise, proposing that they would worship Allah for 1 year if Muhammad agreed to worship their idols the next. But the message of Islam was not built on compromise with falsehood. The Prophet responded firmly that even if they placed the sun in his right hand and the moon in his left, he would never abandon the mission given to him by Allah. The leaders of Quraysh left those meetings frustrated and angry, realizing that persuasion would not work. With every passing month, the number of believers slowly increased. Not all of them were weak or powerless. Some came from respected families within Quraysh itself. The most dramatic example was the conversion of Umar ibn al-Khattab, a strong and feared man known for his harsh opposition to Islam. When he accepted the message, it sent shockwaves through Makkah. For the first time, Muslims began praying openly near the Kaaba, protected by the presence of men like Umar and Hamza ibn Abdul Muttalib, the powerful uncle of the Prophet, who had also embraced Islam. These developments made the leaders of Quraysh feel that their authority was slipping away. Unable to defeat the message through violence alone, they devised a new strategy. Instead of attacking individual believers, they decided to isolate the entire clan of the Prophet. Muhammad belonged to the tribe of Quraysh, but specifically to the clan of Banu Hashim. In the tribal culture of Arabia, loyalty to one's clan meant protection. Even those who did not accept Islam still defended their family members against outside attacks. The leaders of Quraysh realized that as long as Banu Hashim protected Muhammad, they could not harm him directly. So they created a plan meant to break that protection completely. A formal agreement was written and hung inside the Kaaba. It declared that no one in Makkah was allowed to trade with the clan of Banu Hashim, marry into their families, or have any kind of social relationship with them. The boycott was meant to starve them into submission and force them to hand Muhammad over to the Quraysh leaders. With this agreement in place, the entire clan of Banu Hashim, including Muslims and those who had not accepted Islam but still supported family loyalty, withdrew to a narrow valley outside the main city. This place became known as the Valley of Abi Talib. The years that followed were among the most difficult periods in the life of the Prophet and his companions. The valley offered little protection from the harsh desert environment. Food became extremely scarce because merchants in Makkah were forbidden to sell supplies to the clan. Sometimes the only food available was dry leaves from desert plants. Children cried through the night from hunger. The sound of their voices carried across the valley and reached the ears of people in Makkah, reminding them of the suffering that their boycott had caused. Despite the hardship, the Prophet remained patient and steadfast. His message did not weaken. The believers gathered together, encouraging one another and strengthening their faith through prayer and the recitation of the Quran. Abi Talib, although he never formally accepted Islam, continued to protect his nephew with fierce loyalty. Every night he would change the place where Muhammad slept in order to protect him from possible assassination. The entire clan endured this difficult period together, bound by family ties and the belief that justice would eventually prevail. 3 long years passed in this condition. Hunger, exhaustion, and isolation weighed heavily on everyone in the valley. Yet even among the Quraysh leaders, there were some who began to feel uneasy about the cruelty of the boycott. A few respected men in Makkah realized that the situation had gone too far. They began speaking quietly among themselves, questioning whether it was honorable to let children starve simply because of a disagreement about religion. Eventually, several of them decided to act. They gathered in the area near the Kaaba and publicly declared that the boycott agreement was unjust and must end. Some leaders protested, but the pressure grew stronger. When they went to retrieve the document that had been hanging inside the Kaaba, they discovered something remarkable. According to the historical reports, insects had eaten away most of the parchment, leaving only the words that mentioned the name of Allah. This discovery shocked many people and was seen by believers as a sign that the oppression of the boycott would not be allowed to continue. The agreement was torn apart, and the clan of Banu Hashim was finally able to leave the valley and return to the city of Makkah. Although the boycott had ended, the years of hardship had taken a heavy toll. The Prophet and his family had endured enormous physical and emotional strain. Yet even after such suffering, the mission of Islam continued with determination and hope. But another trial was already approaching, one that would touch the Prophet more deeply than any hardship he had faced before. Not long after returning from the valley, the Prophet experienced 2 devastating losses that changed the course of his life. The first was the death of his beloved wife Khadijah. For 25 years, she had been his closest companion, his strongest supporter, and the first person who believed in him when revelations began. During the earliest days of the mission, when the world around him doubted and mocked him, Khadijah stood beside him with unwavering faith. She comforted him when he was afraid, encouraged him when the burden of the mission felt overwhelming, and used her wealth to support the struggling Muslim community. Her death left a deep emptiness in his life. She had been not only his wife, but also his trusted partner in every stage of the early mission. Without her presence, the house that had once been filled with warmth now felt quiet and heavy with grief. The companions of the Prophet understood how profound this loss was, because they had witnessed the love and respect that existed between them. Soon after the death of Khadijah, another pillar of support was taken away. Abi Talib, the uncle who had protected Muhammad since childhood, also passed away. For many years, Abi Talib had used his position as a respected leader of Quraysh to shield the Prophet from direct attack. Even though he did not formally accept Islam, his loyalty to his nephew had prevented the enemies of the message from harming him openly. With his death, that protection disappeared. The loss of both Khadijah and Abi Talib within such a short time created a period of deep sorrow in the life of the Prophet. The year became known among historians as the Year of Sorrow. Without the emotional support of Khadijah and the tribal protection of Abi Talib, the opposition from Quraysh intensified. The insults became harsher and the threats more direct. The Prophet faced these challenges with patience, but the weight of grief and hostility pressed heavily upon him. Yet even in this period of sadness, the mission of Islam did not stop. The Prophet continued calling people to the worship of Allah, traveling beyond Makkah in search of those who might listen to the message. The path ahead would not be easy, but the years of hardship had already proven something important. The message revealed in the Cave of Hira could not be extinguished by persecution, hunger, or loss. Instead, every trial seemed to strengthen the resolve of those who believed, preparing them for the next stage of a journey that would soon carry the message of Islam far beyond the Valley of Makkah. After the year of deep sorrow, the burden of the mission continued to press heavily upon the Prophet. The city of Makkah had become increasingly hostile. Without the protection of his uncle Abi Talib and without the emotional support of Khadijah, the opposition of Quraysh grew more aggressive and open. Yet the Prophet did not retreat from his responsibility. He continued calling people to the worship of Allah alone, reminding them that idols carved from stone could neither help nor harm anyone. He spoke about justice, about accountability before the Creator, and about a day when every human being would stand before Allah. Some people listened with curiosity, but many responded with anger, seeing his message as a threat to the traditions that defined their society. During this difficult time, something extraordinary occurred that would forever stand as one of the greatest miracles in Islamic history. One night, while the Prophet was in Makkah, Allah honored him with a journey that would take him beyond the boundaries of the earth itself. This event is known as Al-Isra and Al-Miraj, the night journey and ascension. It was not a dream or a metaphor, but a real journey that Allah made possible through His power. The night began with the Prophet being taken from the sacred sanctuary of the Kaaba in Makkah to a distant place of worship known as Al-Aqsa in Jerusalem. According to authentic traditions, he traveled on a remarkable creature called Al-Buraq, a being created specifically for this journey, moving with incredible speed across the land. In what seemed like a moment, the distance between Makkah and Jerusalem was crossed, something that would normally take weeks of travel across desert and mountains. When the Prophet arrived at Al-Aqsa, he found himself surrounded by a gathering unlike anything that had ever occurred before. The prophets who had come before him were present there, including figures whose names had been known to humanity for centuries. Among them were Ibrahim, Musa, Isa, and many others who had carried the message of monotheism to their own nations. In that sacred moment, the Prophet Muhammad was asked to lead them in prayer. The significance of this moment was profound. It symbolized the unity of the prophetic mission across time and confirmed that the message he carried was not something new, but the continuation and completion of the same truth that had been delivered by the prophets before him. After the prayer at Al-Aqsa, the journey continued in a way that moved beyond the boundaries of the physical world. The Prophet was taken upward through the heavens in an ascension known as Al-Miraj. At each level of the heavens, he encountered prophets who welcomed him with respect and peace. In the first heaven, he met Adam, the father of humanity. In the next, he met Isa and Yahya. Then he met Yusuf, whose beauty had once been spoken about across generations. He encountered Idris, then Harun, and then Musa. Finally, in the highest of these levels, he met Ibrahim, resting near the house of worship in the heavens that angels circle, just as believers circle the Kaaba on earth. The journey through the heavens revealed the vastness of Allah's creation and the honor that had been given to the Prophet. But one part of this night would carry a direct and lasting impact for every Muslim who would ever live. During this ascension, the command for the daily prayers was given. At first, the number of prayers was greater, but through a dialogue that occurred as the Prophet encountered Musa on his return, the number was reduced until it became the 5 daily prayers that Muslims perform today. These prayers would become the foundation of a Muslim's daily life, a direct connection between the believer and the Creator, repeated day after day across centuries and continents. When the Prophet returned to Makkah that same night, the journey had lasted only a short time, yet the experiences he had witnessed were beyond anything the people of his city could easily comprehend. When he spoke about the night journey and ascension, many of the leaders of Quraysh responded with mockery. They laughed at the idea that someone could travel to Jerusalem and return in a single night. They thought they had found an opportunity to discredit him completely. But the believers remained firm. Abu Bakr, the closest companion of the Prophet, responded with a powerful statement when he heard the story. He said that if Muhammad said it happened, then he believed it. From that moment, Abu Bakr was given the title Al-Siddiq, the one who confirms the truth. Even as the Quraysh continued their hostility, something else was beginning to develop quietly beyond the boundaries of Makkah. Each year during the season of pilgrimage, tribes from across Arabia traveled to the Kaaba. The Prophet would take advantage of these gatherings by speaking to visitors about Islam. He explained the message of monotheism and the moral transformation it offered. Many people listened politely but hesitated to accept, fearing the reaction of their own tribes. Yet among the visitors who came to Makkah were individuals whose hearts were ready to receive the message. One year, a small group of men arrived from a city called Yathrib, located several hundred kilometers north of Makkah. Yathrib was very different from Makkah. Instead of being dominated by a single tribe, it was home to multiple tribes, including the Arab tribes of Aws and Khazraj, as well as several Jewish communities. For many years, these groups had been involved in conflicts and rivalries that left the city divided and unstable. The people of Yathrib were searching for something that could unite them and bring peace to their society. When these men from Yathrib heard the message of the Prophet, they recognized something that resonated deeply with their situation. They had already heard stories from the Jewish communities in their city about the coming of a prophet who would appear in Arabia. Hearing Muhammad speak about the worship of one God and the call to justice and unity made them feel that they were witnessing the fulfillment of those expectations. They accepted Islam and returned to Yathrib with the intention of sharing the message with their people. There they pledged their belief in Allah. There they pledged their belief in Allah and their commitment to follow the teachings of Islam. This meeting became known as the First Pledge of Akaba. It was not yet a political alliance, but a promise of faith and moral conduct. They agreed to worship Allah alone, avoid wrongdoing, protect their families, and obey the Prophet in what was right. After this pledge, the Prophet sent one of his companions, Musab ibn Umair, to Yathrib to teach the Quran and help establish the new Muslim community there. Musab was known for his wisdom and gentle character, and his presence had a remarkable impact on the city. Many people embraced Islam, including influential leaders from both the Aws and Khazraj tribes. Slowly, the message began spreading through homes and gatherings across Yathrib. When the pilgrimage season arrived again the following year, the delegation from Yathrib returned to meet the Prophet once more. This time, the group was larger and their commitment deeper. They gathered again at Akaba during the night and made a pledge that would change the course of history. They promised not only to believe in the message, but also to protect the Prophet as they would protect their own families. They invited him to come to their city and lead them. For the first time, the possibility of a new beginning for the Muslim community appeared clearly on the horizon. For the Prophet, this offer represented something extraordinary. For years, he had faced rejection, persecution, and loss in Makkah. Now a city was opening its doors, offering not only safety but also loyalty and support. The people of Yathrib were ready to build a society based on faith, justice, and unity under the guidance of the message he carried. The moment had arrived when the mission of Islam would move beyond the narrow streets of Makkah and begin a new chapter that would transform the history of Arabia forever. Soon the believers would begin a journey that would mark the beginning of a new era, a migration that would later be remembered as one of the most important turning points in the entire story of Islam. The message of Islam had taken root in the city of Yathrib in a way that no one in Makkah had expected. What began as a quiet conversation between a small group of visitors and the Prophet during the pilgrimage season had grown into something much larger. The men who returned to Yathrib carried with them not only belief, but conviction, and when they spoke about the Prophet and the message of worshipping Allah alone, hearts began to open. Families accepted Islam, gatherings were filled with the recitation of the Quran, and a sense of hope began to replace the long years of tribal conflict that had divided the city. For the first time, the people of Yathrib felt that they had found a path toward unity. They sent word back to the Prophet that their city was ready to receive him, ready to protect him, and ready to build a community around the guidance he brought. Meanwhile, in Makkah, the situation for the Muslims had become increasingly dangerous. The leaders of Quraysh were deeply troubled by the idea that the message they had tried so hard to crush might now find a safe home elsewhere. They feared that if Muhammad established a strong community outside their control, his influence would spread even more rapidly across Arabia. For years, they had relied on intimidation and social pressure to contain the movement. Now they sensed that the balance was shifting. The believers in Makkah were already suffering under constant hostility, but the possibility of migration offered them a way to escape persecution and live freely according to their faith. The Prophet began quietly instructing his companions to leave Makkah and travel to Yathrib in small groups. The departure had to be discreet because Quraysh leaders were watching closely for any sign that the Muslims might escape. Families prepared their belongings in secret. Some left at night, slipping through the narrow streets of Makkah before dawn could reveal their plans. Others pretended to leave for ordinary travel and then continued north toward Yathrib once they were safely outside the city. Each journey was filled with uncertainty. The desert was vast and unforgiving, and anyone caught by Quraysh could face severe punishment. Yet the believers placed their trust in Allah and began the journey anyway, step by step, caravan by caravan. As the Muslims arrived in Yathrib, they were welcomed with warmth and generosity by the local believers who had already embraced Islam. These residents became known as the Ansar, meaning the helpers, because they opened their homes and shared their wealth with the migrants from Makkah. The migrants themselves became known as the Muhajirun, the emigrants who left behind their property and their homeland for the sake of their faith. The bond between these two groups would become one of the most remarkable examples of brotherhood in history. People who had never met before now treated each other as family, sharing food, shelter, and protection without hesitation. Back in Makkah, the leaders of Quraysh soon realized what was happening. One by one, the Muslims were disappearing from the city, leaving behind empty houses and abandoned businesses. The leaders feared that if Muhammad himself managed to leave, their authority would be weakened beyond repair. They gathered in a secret meeting at a place known as Dar al-Nadwa to decide what should be done. The discussion was intense. Some suggested imprisoning him. Others proposed expelling him from the city. Finally, a more ruthless plan emerged. Representatives from several tribes would join together in a single attack, striking Muhammad at the same moment so that responsibility for his death would be shared among many clans. This would make it impossible for the family of Muhammad to seek revenge against any one tribe. But the plan they carefully designed would not succeed. Allah had already revealed the plot to the Prophet and instructed him to leave Makkah. On the night chosen for the assassination attempt, the Prophet asked his young cousin Ali ibn Abi Talib to sleep in his bed so that the assassins waiting outside would believe he was still inside the house. Ali accepted the responsibility without hesitation, knowing the danger involved. Meanwhile, the Prophet quietly left the house and made his way through the darkness toward the home of his closest companion, Abu Bakr. Together they began the journey that would become one of the most significant events in Islamic history. Instead of traveling directly north toward Yathrib, they first moved south to avoid detection and hid in a cave known as Thawr. For 3 days, they remained there while the search for them intensified. Quraysh offered a large reward for anyone who could capture them, and search parties spread across the desert looking for any trace of their path. At one point, the pursuers came so close to the cave that Abu Bakr feared they might discover them. According to authentic reports, he whispered to the Prophet that if the men looked down, they would surely see them. The Prophet responded with calm confidence, reminding him that they were not alone. Allah was with them. It was a moment that captured the essence of trust in divine protection, even when danger seemed only steps away. After the search had quieted, the two travelers continued their journey across the desert. The path toward Yathrib stretched across open land where the sun burned during the day and the cold desert air settled in at night. Yet with every step they moved closer to a new beginning. Word had already reached the people of Yathrib that the Prophet might soon arrive. Each morning groups of believers gathered outside the city, scanning the horizon and waiting with growing anticipation. When the Prophet finally approached the outskirts of Yathrib, the joy of the people was impossible to contain. Men, women, and children came out to greet him, their voices filled with welcome and relief. For years they had heard about the messenger of Allah, and now he was arriving in their city. The atmosphere was filled with gratitude and excitement. The city that had once been divided by tribal conflict was now united in welcoming the man who would guide them toward a new way of life. The Prophet first stayed in a place called Quba, just outside the city. There he established what is considered the first mosque built in Islam. It was a simple structure made with humble materials, yet it symbolized something far greater than its physical appearance. It represented the beginning of a community centered on worship, unity, and obedience to Allah. After a few days, he continued into the main area of Yathrib, which would soon be known by a new name, Madinat al-Nabi, the city of the Prophet. Upon entering the city, the Prophet allowed his camel to walk freely until it stopped at the place where the central mosque would be built. The land belonged to two young orphans, and it was purchased so that the mosque could be constructed there. The Prophet himself participated in the work, carrying bricks alongside his companions. This simple act demonstrated that leadership in Islam was not about privilege, but about service and humility. The mosque quickly became more than just a place of prayer. It served as the heart of the new community. It was where people gathered to learn the Quran, discuss matters affecting society, and strengthen their bonds with one another. One of the first actions the Prophet took was to establish a formal brotherhood between the Muhajirun and the Ansar. Each migrant from Makkah was paired with a resident of Medina, creating a relationship that went beyond friendship. These pairs shared their homes, their resources, and their responsibilities, ensuring that no one was left without support. The transformation of the city was remarkable. Tribes that had once fought bitter wars began to see themselves as part of a single community united by faith. The teachings of Islam emphasized justice, compassion, and responsibility toward others. Gradually, the social structure of Medina shifted from tribal rivalry to a society guided by moral principles and collective purpose. This was more than a migration. It was the beginning of a new chapter in human history. In Makkah, the message of Islam had survived through patience and endurance. In Medina, it would grow into a living society where faith shaped daily life, law, and relationships. The city that had once been called Yathrib was now becoming a center of guidance that would soon influence all of Arabia and eventually the wider world. And at the heart of it stood the Prophet Muhammad, not as a king or ruler seeking power, but as a messenger guiding people back to the worship of the one who created them. The migration to Medina did not end the tension between the Muslims and the leaders of Quraysh. In fact, the move created a new stage in the conflict. The Quraysh of Makkah could not accept that the message they had tried to crush had now found a secure base. For years, they had used persecution, torture, and social pressure to silence the followers of Islam. Now, those followers had become a united community living under the leadership of the Prophet, free to practice their faith openly and organize themselves as a society. This development unsettled the powerful merchants of Makkah, whose influence had long depended on maintaining control over the region. They began preparing for confrontation. In Medina, the Muslim community continued to grow stronger, but the city itself was not without its challenges. The population included the Muhajirun, who had left everything behind in Makkah, the Ansar, who had welcomed them, and several Jewish tribes who had lived in the region for generations. The Prophet worked carefully to create stability among these groups, establishing agreements that defined mutual responsibilities and protection. Justice and fairness were emphasized, and disputes were settled through consultation and guidance from the Quran. Yet the threat from outside the city remained real. The Quraysh had not forgotten their anger, and they were determined to destroy the growing influence of Islam before it spread further. The first major confrontation came in the second year after the migration. A caravan belonging to Quraysh was traveling near the region of Badr, a place known for its wells and water sources. The Muslims set out to intercept the caravan as part of the ongoing economic struggle between the two sides. What began as an attempt to intercept a trade convoy quickly developed into something far more serious. The leaders of Quraysh assembled a large army and marched out from Makkah to protect their interests and demonstrate their strength. The Muslim community suddenly found itself facing a force much larger and better equipped than their own. The believers who set out from Medina numbered only a little more than 300 men. Many of them were not prepared for a major battle. They had limited weapons and only a few horses among them. By contrast, the Quraysh army numbered close to 1,000 fighters, with strong armor and many more animals for mobility. The difference in numbers alone would have discouraged most groups from facing such an opponent, yet the Muslims believed that they were defending not only their lives, but the freedom to worship Allah. The Prophet consulted with his companions before the battle began, asking their opinion about whether they were ready to face the enemy. Their response was filled with determination. They assured him that they would stand beside him no matter the difficulty. The two armies met near the wells of Badr. The tension in the desert air was intense as both sides prepared for the confrontation. The Muslims spent the night before the battle in prayer, asking Allah for strength and guidance. According to the Quran, divine assistance was promised to them during that critical moment. When the battle began, the smaller Muslim force fought with remarkable courage and discipline. The result surprised everyone who witnessed it. Despite being heavily outnumbered, the Muslims achieved a decisive victory. Several leaders of Quraysh, who had been among the most determined enemies of Islam, were killed in the battle, while others were captured. The outcome of Badr had enormous consequences. For the Muslim community, it became a moment of deep spiritual significance, a reminder that faith and perseverance could overcome even overwhelming odds. For the Quraysh, it was a humiliating defeat that ignited a burning desire for revenge. The balance of power in Arabia had begun to shift, and everyone could see that the community in Medina was no longer a small group of refugees, but a force capable of defending itself. The leaders of Quraysh spent the next year preparing for retaliation. Their anger over the defeat at Badr had not faded. Families who had lost relatives in the battle demanded justice and revenge. Eventually, a large army was assembled and marched toward Medina, determined to confront the Muslims once again. The two sides met near a mountain called Uhud, just outside the city. The Prophet carefully organized the Muslim forces for the defense of Medina. Archers were positioned on a hill overlooking the battlefield with clear instructions not to abandon their positions under any circumstances. At the beginning of the battle, the Muslims appeared to gain the upper hand, pushing the Quraysh forces backward. But in the excitement of what seemed like victory, some of the archers left their posts to gather spoils from the battlefield. This movement created a gap in the defensive line. The Quraysh cavalry noticed the opening and launched a sudden attack from behind. The situation changed dramatically. Confusion spread among the Muslim ranks as the battle turned chaotic. Several companions were killed while defending the Prophet, and he himself was injured during the fighting. Rumors even spread across the battlefield that he had been killed, which caused some fighters to lose hope. Yet the Prophet remained alive, and a group of loyal companions gathered around him to protect him until the battle gradually came to an end. The Muslims withdrew toward the mountain, and although the Quraysh had gained the upper hand, they did not pursue the conflict further. The experience of Uhud carried important lessons for the Muslim community. It demonstrated that victory was not guaranteed simply because they had triumphed once before. Discipline, obedience, and patience were essential. The Quran later addressed the events of Uhud directly, reminding believers that setbacks were part of the test of faith, and that perseverance was necessary for those who wished to remain firm in the path of truth. In the years that followed, the tension between Medina and its enemies continued to build. Various tribes formed alliances against the Muslims, believing that if they united their strength, they could finally eliminate the growing influence of Islam. This effort led to another major confrontation known as the Battle of the Trench. A large coalition of tribes marched toward Medina with the intention of besieging the city. Facing a force far larger than their own, the Muslims adopted a defensive strategy suggested by Salman al-Farisi, who proposed digging a trench around the exposed sides of the city. The trench created a barrier that prevented the attacking forces from advancing easily. The siege lasted for several weeks as the coalition struggled to break through the defenses. Harsh winds and internal disagreements among the attacking tribes eventually weakened their resolve. In the end, the coalition withdrew without achieving their goal. The failure of this campaign marked a turning point. After the Battle of the Trench, the momentum of the conflict began to shift decisively in favor of the Muslim community. Not long after these events, another moment arrived that would shape the future of the region in an unexpected way. In the 6th year after the migration, the Prophet had a dream that he and his companions were entering Makkah peacefully to perform the pilgrimage. Encouraged by this vision, he set out with a large group of followers dressed in the simple garments of pilgrims, carrying no weapons except those normally allowed for travelers. Their intention was not to fight, but to perform the sacred rites at the Kaaba. When news of their approach reached Makkah, the leaders of Quraysh reacted with suspicion and fear. They believed the Muslims might be planning an attack under the cover of pilgrimage. Armed forces were sent to block the road leading into the city. The two sides eventually met at a place called Hudaibiyah, just outside the boundaries of Makkah. Negotiations began as both parties tried to avoid open conflict. The discussions were long and often tense, but eventually a treaty was agreed upon. The terms required the Muslims to return to Medina without performing the pilgrimage that year, though they would be allowed to return peacefully the following year. Other conditions seemed unfavorable at first, including an agreement that anyone from Makkah who joined the Muslims without permission would be returned. Some companions felt troubled by these terms, wondering why they had to accept such conditions after the struggles they had endured. Yet the Prophet accepted the treaty with patience and wisdom. Although it appeared difficult in the moment, the agreement created something that had been missing for years, a period of peace. With the constant threat of war temporarily lifted, people across Arabia were able to hear about Islam without the pressure of conflict. Travelers, traders, and tribal leaders moved freely between regions, carrying news of the Muslim community and its message. The result was remarkable. In the months and years that followed, more people accepted Islam than ever before. The message spread through conversation and example rather than battle. What had seemed like a concession turned out to be a strategic victory that opened the door for the next stage in the growth of the Muslim community. The path that began with hardship in Makkah and sacrifice in Medina was now leading toward a moment that would soon change the fate of the sacred city itself. The peace created by the Treaty of Hudaibiyah allowed the message of Islam to spread across Arabia in a way that had never been possible before. For years, tribes had watched the conflict between the Muslims of Medina and the Quraysh of Makkah from a distance, unsure which side would ultimately prevail. With the fighting paused, people began visiting Medina more freely. Many who had once hesitated now found wonder. Many who had once hesitated now found themselves drawn toward the message of Islam. Tribes that had remained neutral slowly began forming alliances with the Muslims, while others accepted Islam directly. The influence of the Prophet was spreading beyond Medina into the wider landscape of Arabia, but peace in Arabia was rarely permanent. Within 2 years, the delicate balance created by the treaty was broken. One of the tribes allied with Quraysh attacked another tribe that had allied itself with the Muslims. This act of aggression violated the agreement made at Hudaibiyah. When news of the attack reached the Prophet in Medina, it was clear that the treaty had been shattered. The leaders of Quraysh soon realized the seriousness of the situation. They understood that breaking the agreement could provoke a response from the Muslims that they might not be able to resist. In Medina, the Prophet began preparing for a journey toward Makkah. This time, however, the circumstances were very different from the years of persecution that had forced the Muslims to leave their homes. The Muslim community had grown strong and united. Tribes across Arabia had joined their ranks, and a large force assembled under the leadership of the Prophet. Yet despite the size of the army, the goal was not revenge or destruction. The Prophet gave clear instructions that unnecessary fighting must be avoided if possible. As the Muslim army moved across the desert toward Makkah, the scale of the force created a sense of awe among those who witnessed it. Thousands of believers traveled together, disciplined and organized, driven not by anger, but by a shared sense of purpose. When they camped near the outskirts of Makkah, their fires filled the night with a glow that could be seen across the valley. The leaders of Quraysh suddenly realized that the balance of power had shifted completely. The man they had once mocked and persecuted was now approaching the city with a force strong enough to take control of it. At this moment, many people expected a final battle filled with bloodshed. The memories of years of persecution were still fresh in the minds of the Muslims. Yet what followed would become one of the most powerful examples of mercy in human history. The Prophet declared that anyone who remained inside their home would be safe. Anyone who sought refuge inside the Kaaba would be safe. Anyone who entered the house of Abu Sufyan, one of the leading figures of Quraysh, would also be safe. These announcements spread quickly through the city, calming fears and preventing widespread resistance. The Muslim army entered Mecca with remarkable restraint. Only a few small skirmishes occurred in isolated areas, but the city itself surrendered without a major battle. For the first time since the early days of revelation, the Prophet returned to the place where his mission had begun. The valley that had once been filled with hostility now stood quiet as he entered the city, with humility rather than pride. His head was lowered in gratitude to Allah, not raised in triumph. One of the first actions taken was to cleanse the Kaaba of the idols that had surrounded it for generations. The Prophet entered the sanctuary and ordered the removal of the statues that filled the space. As each idol was brought down, he recited verses of the Quran declaring that truth had come and falsehood had vanished. The house built by Prophet Ibrahim was restored to its original purpose as a place dedicated solely to the worship of Allah. The people of Makkah gathered in the courtyard near the Kaaba, uncertain about what would happen next. Many of them had spent years opposing the Prophet and persecuting his followers. Some had fought against the Muslims in battle. Others had mocked or insulted him during the early days of his mission. Now they stood before him, expecting punishment or revenge. Instead, they heard words that astonished them. The Prophet asked them what they thought he would do with them. Their answer reflected both fear and hope. They said that he was a noble brother and the son of a noble brother. In response, he spoke words that echoed the forgiveness once given by Prophet Yusuf to his own brothers centuries earlier. He told them that there would be no blame upon them that day and that they were free to go. In a moment when many leaders in history would have chosen vengeance, he chose mercy. This act of forgiveness softened hearts across the city, and many people who had once resisted the message of Islam now embraced it willingly. With Makkah peacefully brought into the fold of Islam, the unity of Arabia began to take shape in a way that had never existed before. Tribes across the region sent delegations to Medina to pledge their loyalty and learn about the teachings of the new faith. The Kaaba once again became the center of worship for believers who recognized the oneness of Allah. The transformation that had begun with a single revelation in the Cave of Hira had now reshaped the spiritual and political landscape of the entire region. 2 years after the peaceful conquest of Mecca, the Prophet performed the pilgrimage that would become known as the Farewell Pilgrimage. By this time, thousands of Muslims from across Arabia gathered to join him in the sacred journey. The rituals of the pilgrimage, which traced their origins back to the time of Ibrahim, were now fully restored to their true meaning. As the believers moved together across the plains of Arafat, a powerful sense of unity filled the gathering. People from different tribes, backgrounds, and regions stood side by side, wearing the same simple garments of pilgrimage. During this journey, the Prophet delivered a sermon that would become one of the most important statements of moral guidance in Islamic history. Speaking to the assembled crowd, he reminded them of the sacredness of life, property, and honor. He emphasized that all forms of injustice and oppression must be abandoned. He declared that the divisions of race and tribe that had once fueled endless conflicts had no place in the sight of Allah. No Arab was superior to a non-Arab, and no non-Arab was superior to an Arab, except through righteousness and awareness of God. These words carried a message of equality that challenged the social hierarchies deeply rooted in the culture of Arabia. He also reminded the believers about their responsibilities toward one another, including kindness toward women and fairness in economic dealings. He urged them to hold firmly to the Quran and his example as sources of guidance. The message of the sermon was clear. The faith they had embraced was not only about belief, but about building a just and compassionate society. Not long after returning to Medina from the pilgrimage, the Prophet began to experience illness. His strength gradually weakened, and the companions who had walked beside him through years of struggle sensed that the final chapter of his life was approaching. Even during his illness, he continued to guide the community, reminding them about prayer and the importance of maintaining unity. In the 11th year after the migration, the moment arrived that would mark the end of his earthly life. Surrounded by those closest to him, the Prophet Muhammad passed away in Medina. The news spread quickly through the city, bringing shock and grief to the companions who had devoted their lives to the message he delivered. For many of them, it felt impossible to imagine the world without him. Yet the legacy he left behind was far greater than any single moment of loss. In a span of just over 2 decades, he had transformed a society divided by tribal conflict into a community united by faith and shared principles. The Quran had been revealed as guidance for humanity, and the example of the Prophet's life had demonstrated how that guidance could be lived in daily life. From the deserts of Arabia, the message of Islam would continue to spread across continents and generations. The man who began his journey as an orphan in the valley of Makkah had fulfilled his mission as the final messenger of Allah, calling humanity back to the worship of the one Creator and leaving behind a legacy that continues to shape the lives of billions of people around the world.